Oh,
Always
two
close to
more.
it. There you are.
Look at you.
Look at that. Oh, no, no,
Three.
no, no, tell you what.
Oh no, it's going to be standing room only.
Okay, that's better. Hello. Hello all. Welcome. Last
happy
session
last
of the
session.
conference. Last session of the conference. The best till last in terms of not only what we're going to say, but what we want to get from you. So we want to run this session slightly differently to just maybe some of the others. We're not going to stand here and go through tons of PowerPoint. We want to get you involved. We want to get you interacting with us. We want to get some opinions from you. We just want to get. Let's treat this like a round table, even though there's no table. Oh yes, there is. There's a round table.
Could you all please come and just stand around this?
This is a round table discussion. Okay.
That'd be awkward. Maybe not.
So
wow. Okay.
So let's just.
Yeah, we're moving right through this.
Do you want to go first?
Please.
I'll go first. Okay. I'm Mark Delgado. I'm the GM of EMEA and APAC at Mitratech. I've been with the business for just over a year. Before Mitratech, I was working for a business called Hightech, which actually Mitratech acquired. And at Hightech, I was working with governance, risk, and compliance products for more than 20 years. So I've got a big and strong, hopefully, experience in GRC products generally.
And I'm Heidi Rudolph. I'm with Moray Global, and I specialize in compliance operations. Prior to being with Moray, I was 10 years in-house doing legal operations, first at the Sears Legal Department, and then at Sara Lee Legal Department, so in the Chicago area. And prior to that, I was also in legal consulting. So I've spent about 25 years in legal and compliance operations and management. And I love compliance, and I hope you all will by the end of this session, or that you'll want to know more about compliance when you leave. So that is the goal today. So get excited for compliance. Okay. At this point, you've probably heard this story before because there have been other folks who have been referencing surveys, but many of you may be in this room because you've read some of these surveys or somebody has mentioned it in your office, you've read an article or seen something come through on an email, but survey after survey is pointing to compliance as a particular high interest area for general counsels, an area of need and opportunity. So we're seeing it sort of over and over again in various surveys.
So should we do a little mini survey here?
Sure.
So out of all of you, the legal departments, legal operations you all work in, who out of all you'd see that you are responsible for compliance in your organizations?
Anybody?
Yeah, the actual responsible party. No? Who is involved in compliance? Who feels that their job or their department has a core involvement in compliance?
Okay.
You administrate.
They moved.
Once I also learned after attending a compliance academy recently that it really shouldn't be a part of the GC role, is what I've learned. But now it's so new, as you stated, that we're creating a whole compliance department now. And right now there's a person that's kind of planted in various departments, but they report to that compliance department.
Okay. Okay. The sort of the trend, if you will, that you just referenced is not atypical. I think companies and somewhat industry related have kind of moved compliance in legal, out of legal. There's an independence question that often comes up, but I would say in the clients, in the industries where I spend a lot of time, it's mostly in the legal department. But again, as Tori, if those of you saw Tori speak about Policy Hub, she talked about her company, HMS Host, where in, legal, out, back, centralized, decentralized, lots of changes. Yeah.
And right now they're physically in our legal department is the new compliance attorney, paralegal.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
So this is one of the big problems, if you like, on how organisations progress. Because there's no single structure, there's no single solution for how compliance and legal need to work together. Sometimes the GC is the Chief Compliance Officer. Sometimes they work closely together, but whichever way it works, I think what is clear is that legal play a core strategic part in defining compliance and in implementing compliance. So yeah, the structure might be slightly different, but the crux and the focus is beginning to converge.
We also have reference here to perhaps some of the reasons that compliance is at that level of attention in the surveys are some of these unfortunate headlines, if you will. Nobody really wants to be in these sorts of headlines in terms of penalties and fines. Many of these are FCPA violations, and I will define things as we go, because I have to tell you, when I first started learning about compliance, people would throw out all these acronyms and as if everybody knew them, and I didn't know all of them. So FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, okay? It's US based, but it affects just about every company in the world. If that company, even if it's a German headquartered company such as Siemens, if their transactions go through banks in the United States, it makes them, for example, subject to some of the FCPA regulations. So, and with Volkswagen, Mark, you had a comment about that.
I love this one. I love this last one because it's often brought up as an example of why compliance needs to be improved and a model of where compliance is going to solve problems. Actually, that's a great example where whatever the compliance program you put in, however rigorous it is, if from the top there is a mission to, should we say, undertaking underhanded practices, then no compliance program is going to stop that. Okay, so if the company is set out to do something which is less than what it should do, then compliance isn't going to stop you. Compliance is there really to protect the business from not executing the goals in the strategic way it wants to execute. So if the strategic goal for the business is to do something fraudulently, then unfortunately that's not going to help. So that's a great example actually where maybe compliance could have been fantastic in Volkswagen, I don't know. Right. But the board decided it wanted to do it, and that's what it did.
Also, just want to quickly mention our little bubble there at the bottom with Warren Buffett and the reputation point. When you think about compliance, and we have another slide coming up, but thinking about reputation and what does it mean to be a compliant company, and I think this morning in our keynote, we heard some great examples about integrity, being a company that does the right thing. And that, to me, goes very much towards Mr. Buffett's point there. Can work both ways, right? I mean, for me, I was so impressed with some of the things that were said this morning. This is the kind of thing that makes me like the company even more, right? Well, then certainly on the other side, not to pick on Uber, but they're kind of an easy example. Some of the conduct issues and the outright defiance of regulation, that to me signified a culture of no compliance, of disregard for compliance. And as a consumer, reputationally, that wasn't something that I was particularly interested in. Even more examples. These lists just go on, and I attended a session, a lawyer, an anti-corruption lawyer in DC led, and he just himself is tracking FCPA violations and the dollar value of the fines and penalties year by year, and it's just increasing and increasing and increasing. And I would have stolen his chart, but I didn't, but he's got just this bar chart that keeps going up. So unfortunately, this list just keeps going. I did not have to go very far back. You see, I went into 2016, and then, of course, many, many people referenced this Siemens case because it was one of the largest ever. And again, of note, it's not a US-based company, it's a German-based company, and yet they were subject to the FCPA Act. External pressures. Okay, so we've talked about the external pressures in terms of, I'm going to use the pointer, if I can here, I'm going to go no tolerance from regulators here, it's kind of what we've talked about. Speed to enforce, right? So we're seeing this accelerated pace and quantity of fines and penalties. But overall, again, I was thinking a lot this morning as during the keynote of how people don't view business favorably. Like business always gets kind of a bad rap, which has always bugged me since I've always worked in business and have thought that I've worked for companies that they were not out to do bad. They were out to do good. They were out to make money because that's part of the shareholder and stakeholder value proposition. But the companies want to do good. Unfortunately, it's not the perception. And I think all these factors here, and in particular, the news cycle and the social media, they want to jump on business. They want to vilify us. And I thought it was funny that Mr. McKay mentioned GMOs because I'm personally very familiar with food companies and GMOs and what a hot topic that is, and how you can be just vilified in social media, et cetera, because of something like GMOs. Anyway, all of these pressures on companies to be an ethical and compliant company and to do the right thing, to not be in the news, to not be one of the ones with the fines and penalties, with being in some regulator's eyes. But this is causing so much urgency and pressure on companies today.
So the fines and penalties is you know, unfortunately, normally the bottom line in many businesses as to how important they treat this kind of issue. And you know, I don't think I'm going to be giving anybody information they don't already know, but the fines and penalties that regulators can now apply on businesses around the world, certainly in this country, but around the world generally, on new regulation that's coming in is significantly higher now than it ever was before. And that is now becoming, I think, a big wake-up call to any, even the most laissez-faire companies, if you like to call it that, on compliance. That's a real wake up to them in sort of paying attention to a lot of this.
So, where are we all in our roles in our companies with compliance? On one hand, kind of question mark at the top, I don't know, necessary evil. You know, we have Mr. Buffett talking to us about reputation. This morning, we had Mr. McKay talking about employees and their productivity and their loyalty, right? So again, sort of the culture he described and the values he espouses, he believes in turn lead to employee productivity and loyalty. And I don't disagree with that premise. Improve the bottom line, as you just mentioned. Finally, there are many instances, there are types of compliance, and we're going to get into that in a minute because the word compliance can be confounding and mean lots of different things. Sometimes it is simply the cost of doing business, right? Somebody has to do it. Everyone's company and industry has some industry-specific compliance, some regulatory compliance that is required in order to do business, right? You have to have licenses, you have to have permits to actually do business in a state or be a broker-dealer. Various aspects of regulatory compliance like that that are just simply part of the cost of doing business. But there are opportunities there, of course, to be more cost-effective with those, right? Those are business processes, not unlike the business processes that you all likely already are dealing with. And part of your job, I'm sure, is being more cost-effective and more efficient. This is no different in these areas of compliance.
Can we just talk about that second one for a second? Because I think that's the, to me, that's the one that of the four that stands out a little bit, because I don't think that's often spoken about. So I'm quite glad you put that on your slide. Are you seeing that being a driver in sort of your engagements with your clients? And we'll ask everybody in a second how they feel about it.
What that ties to in our engagements is tone at the top, right? That the message coming from executive leadership, coming from managers, what is that tone? How do people then in turn feel about their jobs? Do they feel like they're working somewhere where people want to do the right thing? So yes, that actually comes up a lot. We're helping a client right now just sort of refresh their hotline. Well, the whole messaging in this refresh is, we want to hear you. You know, it's kind of the old, what I hear on my train when I go to work, if you see something, say something thing. It's sending out that message, but not just, you know, not just putting it on a screensaver for a week, but having a whole tone around that. And you have to, it's not just a PR campaign, right? There's a lot more that you have to act on. You have to show that you mean there will be disciplinary actions, et cetera. But yes, the employee productivity and loyalty is absolutely a byproduct of that and comes up all of the time.
Okay. So I wonder if that resonates with anybody here. Is it something you even think about when you're at work? Is that as an important part of your engagement with your company? Or have you seen initiatives by your employer that you think are driving towards this kind of thing?
Oh, yeah. What is your experience? Because I know you're involved in some. Sorry to point on you.
I would say that in general, when there are layoffs or restructuring in a company, that the ethics reports go up. Okay. That's when the calls start coming in. Yep. People are unhappy. So there's lots of work around that. I help a lot with our international business conduct program and with the FCPA and everything like that, and you know, having to report when you're entertaining your public officials. You have to document. Well, we're trying to kind of go along the lines of documenting everything so you have it, right? And people kind of don't really want to always let us know. And so our message is to be, we're not saying you can't do it, we're just saying talk to us about it, right? Because there are certain things that, yes, you can do, and then we're going to direct you in other ways. Right. But yeah, definitely the layoffs is when people come out of the bushes.
Okay, so there are certain times when I guess it's in a business's direct interest to be engaging in this way with their employees, but we're going to see, I think, as you've sort of said, we're going to see that's become more and more part of the normal way that a business wants to engage with its workforce, is to give them confidence that, you know, they're working for an ethical company, they're working for a compliant company. It's an important part of what you need to get out from your employer.
Okay, the what is compliance piece. Again, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people and depends on your industry. I like to think of compliance in those three types: conduct, transactional, and regulatory. And the transactional and regulatory can be similar, but the conduct, how many of you in your companies have a code of conduct that you're aware of? Yeah?
Good. Great.
Do you have to do an annual attestation? Okay. Yep, fantastic.
And what form does that take, just out of interest?
So we do regular training to refresh, but it becomes part of the culture. We were just talking about that. It becomes part of your culture. So yeah, we do training. I think every other year there's training, and then we do an annual compliance where all employees are required. It's a part of your employment requirement.
Great.
That you go in and you do your compliance. So yeah, I mean it's really part of our culture now.
Okay.
It's not. It's everywhere.
Okay.
Great, and that's exactly to your point.
Great. Yep. And that's part of the conduct, right? It's setting the expectations for conduct in your company. And some codes of conduct, some of the pieces are pretty standard, but those that I see, they really do speak kind of in the voice of the company. And there are certain things that are going to be a little bit different. Some companies like to take their expectations beyond what the law says and to what they as a company say. Those become kind of codified in the code of conduct, annual attestation and review, and then typically policies will emanate from that. And based on risk assessments, there will be training associated then with some of those policies, but the code is where it begins. And also more and more organizations now too have a supplier code of conduct where there are expectations and annual attestations even from suppliers for a code of conduct again, and those become part of their supplier agreements once they do sign their contracts then with the company. So that's happening more and more. Now I don't see it yet in every company, but more and more the supplier code is becoming standard. Transactional compliance, I think of that as more, for example, in broker-dealer work, right? Or financial services and banking, that there's the monitoring of transactions and that everything is recorded properly and done in a compliant manner. And that is fast-paced, and there's software that can manage and monitor transactional compliance, but different, right, than conduct. I mean, maybe they go together, right? Somebody's doing something wrong, which creates a transaction that is improper. But we're looking at these different types of compliance. Then we get down into regulatory, right? If you are a company with lots of sites, you are going to have lots of environmental issues, right? You're going to have environmental compliance. Again, I mentioned food companies. We have labeling compliance. We have all sorts of different ingredient regulations globally that we're looking at. We have all sorts of food safety regulations. Again, we could keep going. You each could, I'm sure, name things in your companies. Insurance. Insurance, you have different regulations by state. That gets tricky when you are in insurance and you've got state market conduct exams. And some states are way worse than others, aren't they? And they take way more time than others. But these all get put into sometimes into a big bucket just called compliance. And I would assert that companies that are, or industries that are more heavily regulated, compliance is sort of over here. There's compliance is doing that. Compliance is a thing, is a function. But more and more, every company is looking at conduct compliance, and that compliance is everyone's responsibility, that everyone has a role in it somehow or another. Did you want to add?
Yeah, I did. I think that there's also quite a lot of overlap between these things. So a lot of regulatory compliance, a lot of regulation is coming in to enforce codes of conduct. Okay, so things that bluntly companies should be doing anyway. So the big piece of regulation at the moment, for example, or a big piece of regulation that's going globally is the EU GDPR regulation, the data privacy regulation. And there's been a lot of discussions about that in various sessions this week. And one of the questions to one of the panelists on a session I was at yesterday was about, well, we're a US business, we don't deal with the EU, we have no customers in the EU, so GDPR's got nothing to do with us. And the advice back was, I think, extremely sound, is that GDPR isn't suggesting that a business needs to do anything other than run their business properly. You know, be responsible with other people's data, handle it sensibly and sensitively, and that's just good ethics, good codes of conduct in the way that a business runs itself. So a lot of these regulations that are coming in are just underlining, perhaps, and enforcing things that bluntly companies should be doing anyway.
So next we have actual definitions. Right. Improper conduct, mitigating legal and regulatory risks. I think when I look at this too, this collaborates with the business. This is another thing I hear a lot when I'm working with legal departments and compliance lawyers is they say, I don't do compliance, it's the business. The business needs to be compliant. And this is where we get back to conduct and tone, messaging, and training, right? Sometimes you can have somebody do something wrong because they just don't know. So you've heard it before, but we will use the word defensible, right? You're looking to have defensible programs in place so that the person understands that you have a gifts and entertainment policy, and there could be implied or actual misconduct with respect to something that can be construed as a bribe, for example. But you've got to train, right? But it's the business where the actual work is performed and where there are some compliance risks. Okay, so this slide, what does this mean? We are working with a client where everybody just sort of assumes that compliance is just getting handled. And that's what these pictures represent, right? Every day, every week, you get on an airplane and it just takes off and lands, right? It just works. Or you use your computer every day, hopefully, you turn it on and work on it and it works. But behind the scenes, there's so much more that has gone into these actions every single day that we rely on. Well, because I love compliance. Compliance is behind the scenes, kind of the background, keeping things running, right? If you miss a permit, you miss a license, you miss submitting your new label to the health authorities in Argentina, you can't do business. Or if you're caught working with a distributor, a third party who is doing something wrong, what happens to you then? Right? These things don't just happen. This is where this is getting us next to kind of what are the programs and topics that go into compliance. And for me, looking back on my legal ops role at Sara Lee, I think, wow, why wasn't I and our legal ops group, why weren't we helping with some of these things? So it's sort of interesting for me to look back on that. But I think in part it's what's happened over the last few years in terms of this sort of heightened level of attention, risk, and cost associated with compliance.
So just, yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is the airline industry and air travel generally is a great example of an industry that has a culture of compliance kind of built in from the core. It's one of the best examples of driving improved safety records for airlines is a great example of where an industry has taken it upon themselves to continuously improve. Every time there's an accident, there's a big investigation, and processes and procedures and the way the airlines run and the way the whole air system runs gets continually tweaked and improved to the point now where we have a fantastic record globally for airline safety. If the same was to be true in financial services over the last 20 years, I'm not even going to finish the sentence, but sometimes a regulator needs to get in and put right, bluntly, an industry that is in itself gone a little bit stale and gone a bit bad. The airline industry and air travel is a great example of where actually it doesn't have to be the big fist, does it?
That's a great point. Okay, lots of stuff on this slide. Elements of a compliance program. This is by no means even comprehensive, okay? This is what would fit on the slide. So your company could have other elements too, and we can go on and on. And this is where, I'll give you an example of a associate general counsel for a 60,000 employee company called earlier this year, and she said, I have these goals for our compliance program. I'm charged with the implementation. She said, but it's just me, and I'm not a program manager. And I knew right then she really sort of got it, that when you look at these programs and topics, and you go back to the definition slide about the business, right? Compliance programs, they're not just about the law department or the compliance department, they're about the business, and they're about how to embed these programs in the business. The lawyers are so critical to understanding the risks, to understanding the particular business processes that they need to look at. They need to look at new legislation such as the GDPR and figure out how it's going to impact their business. But then they have to implement the programs right throughout their overall business. This is where, to me, I see an intersection with legal ops if, in fact, that compliance person, so the woman I just referred to, she's in the legal department, that's where they have compliance sitting. And I think about what she's working on so far, we're working on culture, we're working on tools, we're working on program management. Audit's going to come later, because we have to get all these other things in place first before they can be monitored or audited. But to me, the tools and the program management, without a doubt, are things that have skill needs that folks in legal ops have and may already be sitting in the very department where there is a person newly charged with compliance, which is happening a lot. We're seeing a lot of people who maybe were lawyers who did a lot of internal investigations, and then somebody said, hey, you're really good at those internal investigations. How about if you also just take on compliance overall? But how then does that person, what do they do when they're kind of looking at this? Hopefully they start thinking about tools and processes, but that's not always the first thing that a lawyer is going to think about. But legal ops, it might be the first thing that you're thinking about.
I'll tell you what, the first thing I think about if I was presented with that list, I would be completely overwhelmed.
Yeah?
I mean, that's just, where do you start? And I guess
Right.
that's a problem that you help solve when you go in and talk to people. It's how you identify what's a priority, because you obviously can't do all of that in one
Right.
go.
Code of conduct and hotlines are usually the first two things, right? Most everybody has had a hotline. But some companies think it's a good thing when they don't get a lot of calls to their hotline, right? Counterintuitive. It's actually, that means you probably don't have it well publicized. People are not getting the messaging of speak up. It's not a good thing. I mean, it might be, but it could be, that would be a unique company, and I would love to meet that company. But I think in part because hotlines, it's kind of like, well, that's compliance. We've got a hotline. People can call it. But those two are usually where we start, right? The code of conduct. So that, and it sounds like in this room, these codes exist, and everyone has a hotline, right? There's a hotline. You all know where to call. Okay. I'm just curious, in the room, the hotline, is it publicized with posters? Anybody? Yeah? Okay. Okay. Okay, that's great. What about on your intranet? Is there a dedicated sort of integrity or compliance area that's easy to get to? Yeah? Okay, excellent. That's also definitely best practice. Anybody that has to hunt around to find a hotline number, that is ineffective. Anonymous reporting, right? People have a lot of concerns about that. Publicizing or letting people know that it is a third party that is separate and will be reporting as much or as little as possible, right? But letting people know that that's kind of how this works. But Mark, back to your point.
Yeah.
This is a pretty daunting list, and we're seeing companies where a person in charge of compliance is sitting down today and putting a 3 to 5 year compliance roadmap in place and looking at these topics. And if you look at also right here, risk assessments, compliance programs really should all sort of derive from risk assessments, right? Where does your business have the greatest risk, either by the type of product or service that you manufacture or deliver, and or where you're operating, right? We have certain countries that are much higher risk. Are any of you familiar with, or do you use Transparency International? Has anyone seen that? I would suspect in your role, it's, they produce a score by country for corruption risk. And they have this really lovely heat map of the world with red, orange, et cetera, showing the countries with the highest and lowest corruption index. That score is updated annually and is used pretty routinely by companies in how they are then sort of risk assessing their business and where they're devoting, for example, live training. You might need to send somebody live and in person to do training with sales in Brazil, for example, because it has a higher risk profile than, say, England, right? But Transparency International is a great resource in that.
So how much of that kind of strikes a chord with anybody in the room in terms of what they're actually directly involved with? Maybe something from what you currently manage is kind of relates to some of this? Yeah, all of it.
A lot of like the international business conduct and then everything kind of beneath it. But I find the key topic is third party, the due diligence and screening. How far, like best practice, do you go with that when you are doing your due diligence on, potential agent that you're entering into a representative agreement with? You have 3 people in the office. How far do you go with that? Is there, because it can get expensive too, depending where you use. We use Thomson Reuters or whatever. Sometimes those searches can be like $7,000 for one person.
Yeah.
So, best practice with that. How far would you go, like to the boards of directors, and then ownership from there? Like, where do you kind of draw the line?
Risk appetite by the company. One client that I work with is a global manufacturer, so they have a lot of distributors and agents, and they as a company don't sell directly at all, so these distributors are really critical to their business. And they have a questionnaire that they developed, and there's a scoring that goes with it, and included in it is even this corruption index that I just referenced. So the scoring, it does a calculation, and the third party gets assigned a level 1, 2, or 3, and based upon that score determines what level of diligence is required. So a lot of them are level 1, okay? And that then you do a media screen, you do online search, you make sure it's an actual site, you check the officers and directors, and that's pretty quick. But then, level 2 and 3 require quite a bit more, and level 3 in particular can be the ones that can get very expensive. But you might make a decision in advance that there's an alternative agent or party, right? That maybe you don't want to take that risk, so you're not going to even bother, or you want to do that level of diligence and look to see how you can mitigate the associated risks, right? But there should by no means be an equal distributions of 1s, 2s, and 3s, right? You're going to hope that it's skewing to the 1s and that there's few that are the 3s. But then this gets to, again, the risk appetite and how far you want to go. It depends on your business, depends on your brand.
It also depends on the transaction that you're wanting to execute with that third party, because there's a huge great spread in how you might interact with that third party, what information you're sharing, how sensitive that information is. Maybe it's third party information from one of your clients. So I think it's as much to do with how important you see that interaction and how sensitive you feel that interaction is, that would determine how much diligence you put into assessing whether you should be doing business with that person or that entity.
Trying to add a lot of, extra language in there. So like if you're signing your agreement with us, you're also agreeing to comply with our international business conduct program, which means you are going to do our training and you are going to sign off annually and you are going to do all that. So that's
definitely
Great.
Best practice too.
So, sorry.
Just as you think through it, I know we're talking about international sort of third-party due diligence, but even as I see some financial clients in the room, with all this data and cybersecurity and law firms having a lot of information, they're a pretty big sort of vendor partner. I mean, they may have 50,000 client information. Are you seeing a lot of that also, even in a US context, happening, and there's more diligence being put together in these sort of programs that is more around their law firms or vendor providers or whatever their data is, and so on. Similar rigorous aspects are being levered by the compliance program, or is it more in the IT side? I mean, just sort of a question.
Oh, on the law firm kind of exposure part, after attending the session yesterday, one of my clients, I want to go back to them and talk to them about their third-party diligence, in particular that they do on law firms, because they don't go further. And for me, that was a great session, and I'd like to see if we might want to take that third-party diligence process a little farther for some specific categories of third parties that would have sensitive information. This is a manufacturer, they're going to have patents, for example. They will have, and they do a lot of acquisitions, so they have a lot of sensitive transactional documents. So I think it is worth expanding that. Do you want more to add on that?
No, I would agree. I would agree with all of that. I was going to make a point about your list. And one thing I was wondering that wasn't on your list that I thought would be.
It didn't fit. What is it?
It's change management, regulatory change management, obligation change management. Sorry.
I'm rolling my eyes
Yeah.
because it is a huge issue for one of my clients.
Well, it's a huge issue, I think, for anybody interested in any of those topics, because all of those topics are not static. There are changing, they're all changing landscapes in terms of what companies are expected to do to adhere to these things. So how do you see that change management program being incorporated into how people run their operations for compliance?
So that, if anybody solved that overall, globally, in every single market, I'd love to know, because this client operates in 160 markets, and they have found it very challenging to get regulatory changes for every market in which they operate. They have some tools in place, and they rely a lot on just their boots on the ground. They're lawyers in various parts of the world. They rely very heavily on trade associations. They cannot possibly cover the 160 markets, so it can become a problem. The secret is where are you getting the information? You have to rely typically on public websites of countries, right? You have to rely on the health authorities, the health ministry. The challenge is so tricky when you have a country or a government that doesn't publish, and 2 weeks later they put into effect a labeling regulation that had not been previously published. So to me, a company has to do a cost-benefit analysis of how much time they can even put into covering that. They have to look at the market, the size of the market, and again, it goes back to risk.
Yeah, I think something certainly we're seeing with our clients is that where businesses are global and regulatory pressures are different in different parts of the world, rather than have their business do things differently in all these different parts and have a very, very complicated operational structure, then they take bluntly the most regulated approach and put an operational program out to implement it globally, so that they end up with best practice for their global organization, and they run a single set of processes and everybody runs the same thing, knowing that they're going to be compliant for whichever jurisdiction or geography that they happen to work in.
Right. Again, with all of these tools, program management, analytics, like let's go back even to the hotline for a minute. I think about our hotline reports that we did at Sara Lee back 5 or 6 years ago, and they were just pretty basic. The number of calls that came in, the number that got closed. They had a metric of that delta between open and closed. But I think about where those might be today, and I think legal ops are the people that are really good at presenting data and helping things to be even more visual, to be a more impactful way to show or spot trends. Surely in a well-publicized and valued hotline, there is good data there to mine, not just sort of gotcha data, but even things of policies or something that may not be well understood, right? You can learn a lot through your hotline if you are mining that data appropriately. And again, I think legal ops, may have the skill set there to look at that data and look at that reporting. Just as an example, you will continue to see more tools emerging that help to support compliance. There are many here.
They're already here. Hopefully you've seen a few of them this week.
Yes, hopefully you've. I'm personally pretty excited about Policy Hub, and I want to learn more about it because I think I have some clients and people that I know that I think it will be very valuable for their organization. But the other tools as well are ones that I'm looking forward to learning more about to see how they can help the companies that I work with to be more efficient, to be more cost effective, and to be in compliance. I'm continued to be haunted by an outside auditor from Lloyd's coming to my client 3 years ago and saying to me and the lawyer, how do you know you're in compliance? And our answer is sort of because we haven't gotten dinged. You know, it's sort of, we only know because we haven't been told we're not, so we assume we are, which is a horrible answer. So we're looking to establish the programs and the monitoring and the reporting that show that we're in compliance. Yeah, you've had your hand up, I'm sorry.
Let me ask you, what do you recommend and what would be the ideal organizational structure for a compliance group where a legal ops person is in there somewhere? Are they project manager or?
Yeah, great question.
How would that look?
A company that I consider to have a pretty best-in-class program right now within the legal department, they have a compliance director and a compliance manager who are not lawyers. I would say they are more typical of a legal ops person, and they could probably easily do legal ops, but they are specifically dedicated to compliance. They are, in this particular company, reporting directly to the Associate General Counsel. If they had a bigger legal ops team, I could see those people reporting into legal ops because I think there would be some ideal sort of cross-training and shared expertise. But the people don't even really exist yet. And so this particular client, they're just putting it where they think it makes sense for now. But I think we'll see it evolve eventually to be legal and compliance operations, is what I think. But it's going to still take us a while to get there. But some of your systems, even for example, what I've heard of people of how they're using Team Connect, for example, they're using Team Connect in ways that are supporting their compliance activities, right? So you can see then, ideally, or eventually, all be together. But I don't have one great, best organizational practice at this point. It's handled completely differently everywhere that I'm helping.
Your point on tools is a good one. Actually, let's talk about tools. So why is there a focus on tools on this slide? I think it's probably there's a couple of reasons that I think it's probably worth highlighting. I've spoken to several clients this week, and I've spoken about policy, and I've spoken about risk, and they kind of tell me, yeah, we've got systems in place. We've got it. So I've got an Excel spreadsheet with a risk register on it, and I feel pretty comfortable that that's accurate and it's about up to date. And I generate reports from my management, and that's great. And I put my policies on SharePoint, and that's fine because I know they're all there, and everybody knows they're there. So why are more sophisticated tools important? I think other than the obvious reasons of becoming in inverted commas, more compliant and having more rigor in that process, the ability to prove compliance or the ability to demonstrate best practice, I think that's probably a better place, better set of words. If you have an auditor come in or you have any form of investigation to something that might have occurred in your business, if you have the correct set, if you have an up-to-date set of tools, if they have been implemented properly and there's an overall compliance program within which they sit, you're less likely to be treated anything other than sort of reasonably superficially. The office next door or the business in the next building is unlikely to be as sophisticated as you are necessarily, so they're going to be paying much more attention to those guys than you. If you can very quickly demonstrate that you've got best practice programs in place, best of breed tools in place to manage your risk, to manage your policy, that's often enough for an investigator or an auditor to satisfy themselves that you're doing, you've got everything under control, you're doing what you can. They'll be much more interested in the guys who've got nothing, because there's plenty of those guys left. So that's one, I think one reason that may not be immediately obvious. The other one is, I think, quite important, and that is, and I think as the compliance market generally matures a little bit more, this will become more and more important, and that's cost reduction. So yeah, you can run stuff on a spreadsheet in terms of risk and generate reports and then print them out or email them out manually and all that kind of stuff. Or you can generate policies and stick them on SharePoint and then ask line managers to go around their staff and ask them or to make sure these guys have read them and affirm them and maybe have little interviews as part of their annual assessment to make sure they're up to date on their policies. But that is a very expensive way of ensuring compliance. A lot of what these tools do is produce significant cost savings in the operational side of being compliant. So that's something that may not be immediately obvious, but I think will become more and more important, as I said, as businesses become or gain a greater maturity in how they look at these things.
Also in terms of tools, there are a lot of people talking about artificial intelligence tools for compliance where, for example, you may start scanning emails looking for words and conversations that may imply bribery, anti-corruption sort of risk. Marry those up with expense reports and gifts and entertainment, right? You put those together, triangulate then with perhaps a higher risk country, and if you've got systems that are learning, and again, I can't even begin to yet imagine what those are going to look like, but I have a couple of compliance podcasts that I listen to. They're really fun if you're a compliance nerd, and they're talking a lot about artificial intelligence being used to help monitor compliance.
Okay, I know we're short of time.
Okay,
last point on the
sorry.
slide, just very last point on the slide, because I think it's quite important, is that this is you could have drawn a big circle with an arrow on it for that set of jigsaw pieces.
Absolutely.
So yeah, you need to set culture, you need to get some best of breed tools, you need to have the right program in place or set of programs in place. But what comes out of your audits will then drive maybe an update in culture, certainly an update in potential tools and a change in the way you think about your program. And that's a continuous process.
Yep, the pieces need to fit together.
Exactly. So it's not a one-off job. This is a plan you need to put in place on a continuous basis.
So what we wanted to do is give you a new perspective, right? To tie it all together. Legal ops. Maybe there's a role for legal ops here. Wanted to provide you with a little bit of background, a little bit what's happening, maybe trends, maybe things what's coming, give you a new perspective on compliance, and maybe you think now it's super exciting, which I hope. So I just have a few examples here of a new perspective. I now have a la carte TV at home. My husband just cut the cord on everything. I'm still not used to it. I don't always like change. Bitcoin, I don't know. And then, of course, lots of people complain in the United States about Common Core. But again, these are all new perspectives on old ways of doing things, right? So with that, of course, the mystery is solved, right? Now you know the answer to the question of where are the legal ops pros? You're here, and hopefully now we've given you a little bit of insight, maybe a couple things you weren't familiar with before. Things to look ahead to, and ways in which you might see a role for yourselves or those of your colleagues in supporting the overall compliance objectives of your company and become compliance heroes. Yay!
Does anybody have any questions before we finish up?
Yeah.
No, it's good. It's fine.
In 2016, ISO came out with an anti-bribery management system. Have you seen that lots of companies are going that way and like having their program kind of become that certification, like under ISO?
I haven't seen anybody yet get certified.
No.
But I'm sure it's coming.
It gets discussed, certainly.
Yep.
But I'm not aware of anybody who's reached that level.
Yeah, not yet. Any other questions, ideas? Any roadblocks? Anyone see? Yeah.
When you say roadblocks, again, I'm going to the opportunities that you presented today that may exist for legal ops and compliance. In compliance, usually they're looking for oftentimes a JD, maybe even accounting background. I guess there's some selling that needs to be done on the part of that legal ops person.
Yep.
To convince compliance that, hey, I can be an asset, I'm sure.
That's a great point. And that's why I think sometimes if you're already there, right, and you're already helping support some other programs, it may be kind of for you to possibly raise your hand. But it begins with kind of having somebody in charge of it, like the woman I referenced who said she's not a program manager, right? So she kind of got it that she can't do all these things. And she kind of knew intuitively that those sorts of skill sets are what she needs. I often get people asking us for job descriptions or helping find, people to be compliance managers in legal departments. And often, we'll say, look within your own department already. Look to internal audit sometimes. We rarely, in sort of those roles, are seeing lawyers go into the compliance manager kind of director roles. So, because it's a different skill set. It's some of the program management, systems, processes, et cetera.
So last question from me then for you guys. Having heard all of this, does anybody still feel that legal ops has no place to play in a successful compliance program rollout? We've succeeded.
Hard
All right.
to say, right?
Yeah.
Maybe we'll have to come back in 3 years. And we'll do this same thing again in 3 years. We'll change the title a little bit, and you guys will all say, oh, here's what we're doing now.
Absolutely.
So,
Thank you all very much.
Thank you all. Enjoy your
Thank
evening
you.
tonight.